Hi, everyone. Welcome and welcome back to this fourth and final virtual session of the day, Take Action, with speakers Neeraj, Bhatia, Charlotte Malterre-Barthes, and Mason White. To introduce myself, I'm Emily Chung. I'm an architecture student at Cal Poly SLO, and I've been working with Padma Maitland to develop the After Hope digital platform. This session will be moderated by Neeraj Bhatia. Neeraj is an architect, urban designer, and educator whose work resides at the intersection of politics, infrastructure, and urbanism. He's the founder of the design practice, The Open Workshop, and associate professor at the California College of the Arts, where he also directs the Urbanism Research Lab, the Urban Works Agency. He'll be joined by Charlotte Malterre-Barthes, who is an architect, scholar, urban designer, and assistant professor of urban design at Harvard University Graduate School of Design. Mason White is an assistant professor at the University of Toronto Daniels Faculty of Architecture, Landscape, and Design, where he conducts studies on the intersections between infrastructure and architecture. And I'll hand it over to Neeraj.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen. Give me 1 second here. All right. So thank you so much for having us today. And thank you to everyone out there joining this panel, which is on the topic of taking action. And thank you, Padma, for giving us the space and the platform to have this discussion today. We're really excited to be here. And we think this topic of taking action is something that a lot of designers and architects, landscape architects, planners have been thinking about. So this panel will be focused a little bit more on spatial design and the role that spatial design might play in taking action. And this really, the idea of taking action or the topic of taking action aligns with the publication that Mason and I recently put out and edited of a book by the same name. And so I'll be hosting today along with my co-editor, Mason White, who's at the University of Toronto and partner of the office, Lateral Office. Before we dig into the content of the panel, a big thank you to everyone at the Asian Art Museum, the After Hope group, who have been setting up a lot of things in the background and really making sure this all runs smoothly. And fingers crossed we can keep it running smoothly today. So as designers, you know, I will say it's been difficult to operate, you know, this last year with hope. I think there's many things to make us maybe unhopeful, but I think at the core of design and core of being a designer, you're always working with some level of optimism, some idea that what you produce in the world somehow or in some way makes the world a better place. And I think there's many things that we see that are happening around us, and many of these kind of challenges that are systemic in nature that do make us unhopeful at the same time. And these are really related to how power is distributed, whether we're talking about equity and income and you know, the difference between how the top 1% and the lower, you know, 70%, 80, 90% are living, whether we talk about access or even our relationship to the natural environment, and how spaces are being commodified. I think at the same time, though, this, you know, through these kind of forms of oppression, solidarity networks often form that really leverage spatial and non-spatial networks. Of course, we're all aware of a very direct form of action that occurred in the last year through the death of George Floyd. And these were really inspiring acts of coming together and using the city as a spatial theater for a form of action. We also simultaneously see other forms of action emerging in more digital, non-spatial environments. This one actually caught my eye last year when the fans of BTS sort of signal jammed one of the Trump rallies registrations and actually were able to thwart and create an empty rally through doing so. So we see this kind of range of ways that people are taking action. This is something that Mason and I wanted to somehow put out to a larger general audience and a question. And these are some of the ideas that, you know, came back, we'll present, you know, just now.
Yeah, so picking up on Neeraj's introduction, that the book that came out about a year and a half ago formed the sort of backbone of this premise for our panel today. We co-edited this fourth issue of a journal we've co-founded called Bracket. And the theme for this fourth issue was called Takes Action. It's a collection of architecture and urban design related projects and texts that engage various forms and roles for action. The collection really sought to revisit Hannah Arendt's notion of, quote, action as one of the three tenets, along with labor and work, of the vita active or active life. Action, she writes, is a necessary catalyst for, quote, the human condition of plurality, end quote, which is an expression of the common public and the distinct individual. However, more than 50 years later, we appear in a multitude of ways. Therefore, the role of spatial practice in relation to forms of action also needs to be re-examined. Spatial practice's role in anticipating, resisting, organizing, or absorbing action has been broadly challenged by shifts in notions of publicness, social practice, and roles of government. How and where to act is increasingly complex, as it requires new techniques and assemblies to reflect the tendencies of distinct factions and their associated values. Now, Takes Action emerged from conversations between Neeraj and I in 2016, reacting to a series of events then, from the Arab Spring to Wall Street to the Umbrella Movement. These were all forms of action that used the spaces of the city as a theater for assembly and demonstration. The 2021 presents an ever wider range of conditions and manifestations for design to respond to action. And we really wanted the issue to probe all of the different ways that action was emerging and ask how design might incite forms of sociopolitical action. These forms of action span from the domestic realm to public space, from online to offline, and from confrontation to subtle recalibrations. The collection is structured into 6 sub-themes: reaction, counteraction, interaction, faction, inaction, and retroaction. And these themes start to reveal the diversity of issues, methods, and most importantly, the relevancy of the topics to designers and design thinkers.
So we'll just kind of touch briefly on how we've defined these themes. And one thing we should mention is that Bracket as a journal is put out for open call, so anyone can submit. So this isn't Mason and I soliciting peers. We really are interested in a breadth and diversity of approaches that might be things that sit outside our radar and outside our working methodologies as well. So the first chapter, titled Reaction, consists of bold statements and projects that are reactionary in nature. Reaction refers to reconceptualizing everyday elements of life, such as the suburban home or speculative office tower, to challenging negotiations within agonistic pluralism. What can design do when it is entitled to simply react? Counteraction offers a unique and alternative sites for action at various scales. These include playful surfaces, hidden kitchens, refugee camps, and new demands of the civic square. How can the overlooked sites of appearance in our contemporary commons promote alternative forms of action? Oh, you might be muted, Mason, sorry.
Okay, interaction with me. Interaction consists of projects and articles that consider how participatory interactions can occur, how new stakeholders are introduced, and how the relationships between people and their environment impact politics. It asks, what is the spatial agency of the individual in relation to the pluralistic collective? This next section, titled Factions, are situated within a particular constituency and interrogate how these groups act internally as well as interface with other groups. These projects and articles foreground the commonality of the subject as a way to consider a specific form of actions. It asks, in what way is the formation and emergence of sub-collectives informed and empowered by design? Section 5 is about inactions. And inactions are ways of acting by not acting. From squatting and loitering to waiting lands, inaction is an effective way to sidestep, undermine, or identify loops within a system. Or how might design engage sociopolitical change with the least means necessary? And finally, section 6 is titled RetroAction. RetroAction gathers together projects and texts that center on the contemporary role of memory, memorials, and commemoration of our understanding of valuing and giving place to history. Or how do forms of action participate in the registration of memory and foster a sense of historical recollection?
So that's a very brief overview of the book, and Mason and I can copy a link of where you can purchase the book. And actually, we have a very special discount code for anyone out there today if you are interested in looking at more detail. But today and in this event, we're really inspired by the framework that's been set up of future forms and alternative methods. And we wanted to engage these two themes. And we're really excited to have Charlotte here with us today. So Charlotte, as I introduced just briefly, she holds a PhD in architecture from the ETH in Zurich and is an assistant professor of urban design at Harvard GSD. She maintains a practice centered on what she calls parity work, in which she works both within and outside of institutional frameworks. She's also co-founder of Omnibus, an urban design laboratory focused on interdisciplinary exploration of community building factors in various metropolitan contexts. So welcome, Charlotte. We're really inspired by all the work you're doing, of the various conversations you're involved in and have initiated. And we're really hoping to focus our discussion today on both these questions of future forms as well as alternative methods.
Thanks. No, I'm really thrilled to be here, and I think it's a great great topic. I was just in a well, this is the beauty of those Zoom days. I was just in a visiting school in Stuttgart, which is about post-carbon material practices. And, very much so the conversation was revolving around the role of architects in taking action. And of course, inevitably, the kind of position that we're taking, recently or not so recently, and that I think are also mentioned in the book at times by prominent colleagues who have basically discounted the need for architects to engage politically was brought forth, and we had a discussion about that. And this was, and I think this is interesting to see, we mentioned also how that research that you've assembled through, collecting ways to engage with political question is already from a few years back, and I think that the conversation is really shifting currently towards accountability, and that also involves accountability of designers and of design institutions, as we face a kind of devastating climate crisis, which is only just really starting. And I think we find, I can't help to talk about this because this also concurs with the COP 26 conference, where all our lovely leaders have been flying there, and the kind of also questions of greenwashing has been kind of to the fore. And I can't help but noticing that I was in this laboratory discussion, but I can't help to notice that our colleagues, or the profession, is kind of not very vocal. I haven't really heard. I think the last thing was published in The Guardian. There was actually an article by an interview of Jack Herzog saying that he doesn't see how to engage, or he thinks that the way he engages through building, which is, a kind of easy answer. So I wonder where you locate that work if we look at today, because in a way it feels like the distance that design has maintained to political question or even, kind of responsibility in fueling the climate crisis. I mean, construction is 50% of CO2 emission. So where is this going? I would ask. So maybe I just send you back the question, because I think you've assembled work and examples and so on and so forth. So I'm just curious to perhaps ask that.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I'm glad you bring this to the foreground. And one thing that Mason and I have been kind of going back and forth on is, can you rebuild the world without fundamentally rethinking how practice operates within architecture, landscape architecture, urban design, that maybe there's actually needs to be alternative ways that practices are formed, different relationships between clients, and some of the things that actually are listed here on the slide are maybe ways into some of these topics. So for instance, architecture has typically been seen as the single authored discipline, although we know that it's highly collaborative. And I think questions around authorship are really important to kind of think about today, and who's at the table while making decisions. And is authorship, as it gets distributed, is there also a role for being anonymous? Are some voices actually amplified when being anonymous? We also had a discussion about research and the role of research in design, and thinking about it as kind of modes of discovery and creating tools that are more inclusive, but also using research not as an alibi to, do the thing that you were going to do, but actually to leave an open-endedness to allow for that, the research informing maybe ways of design. We talked about, sites that architects have looked at, and scales that they've looked at, and maybe thinking more broadly about other geographies, other places that we might engage to address these issues. So for instance, like, is looking at the way resource extraction done, is that an architectural issue that might be engaged and kind of taught at a young, within schools themselves? So students are more inclined to take on these topics upon graduation, as well as the scale of design. Are we limited to the building, or can we actually expand to think about the broader networks and territories that buildings are part of, and oftentimes complicit in, defining? Questions about value, how we might shift kind of conversations of value production from solely an economic, question to other forms of value, as well as how we evaluate our projects. I think this is kind of, for me, a very interesting thing, because still today in most architecture reviews, the aesthetics of the thing produced and the aesthetics of how it's been represented through drawings and models still seems to trump a lot of the conversation, and how we might increase the range of ways we evaluate a project. And then, questions around representation and documentation and narrative as a way to kind of see this both as something like climate change is obviously a technical problem on one hand, perhaps even elements of engineering, but it's more importantly a cultural issue, and a question of maybe drawing people in through narrative to see the world differently is maybe the first step into problems like this. So this is a very broad, but I think for us, we're actually really interested in maybe the methods coming before even speaking about future forms, because we're really trying to understand, do we need to just reassess the way the discipline works, how it works, where it operates, the scales it operates, and the methods by which we work, before we can even tackle some of these issues, because so much of the discipline has been situated in working in a very particular way for one form of product or output. So I guess I'd be curious, because Charlotte, you've worked on so many amazing projects, and I think are really a leader in thinking about alternative ways of engaging practice and bringing these discussions to the forefront. I'd be curious to learn from you just some of the techniques, strategies that you've found or experimented with, what you've kind of seen to be more successful, and where you might see kind of agency within these methods. And obviously there's more than what Mason and I brainstormed here. So if you'll also add to this list, but we thought we'd just put this out as a way to get started.
Right. Are you asking me how to get into trouble? Yeah, I mean, I think that the kind of I can just obviously reflect a little bit on some of the ways that I've tried to engage. And I think it's interesting you mentioned earlier the question of anonymity. So for instance, I can say that I started my engagement in an anonymous way, pre Instagram accounts. I mean, I think that now you can almost you can do that in an easier way. I think that, for instance, critical accounts that you can find on Instagram, like Denk Lloyd Wright and a few others that are pointing at the shortcomings of the discipline or of the profession or of the practice at large, are extremely useful. Of course, they are they remain what they are, so they have a kind of power, but of course it's limited. But I think that ultimately probably relates to structures of power. So how are you to operate in an institute, not an institution, but in a profession where calling out is not something that people feel comfortable doing because you find yourself, because you're employed in an office and your life depends on having a job, very very kind of basic, and that's kind of mostly the case. People don't feel comfortable voicing critique. So I think that somehow very early works or like attempts to engage for me where I think they're grounded in like early activism that is more political and not related to architecture, but somehow very quickly these things started to align. And using, so for instance, printed matters and then mailing them to architectural offices was, for instance, something that was the one of the methods that we used very early on as way to engage. Of course, there was very little response because that one just went to the office and that was it. It was probably ending up in the trash, or someone might have read it. Funny enough, it kind of some of these things have their life of their own, and they found an audience. But in any case, I think so that was kind of the tools of the week, in a way, like the kind of tactical ways that you can actually engage and feel like you have to engage with these topics and there is nowhere to really go with that. I think later on, for instance, when I started to work in academic institution, there it was I kind of crafted together with colleagues something that we refer to as institutional activism, which was about calling out the institution and very much trying to use the kind of language of diversity, for instance, or the claims for being serious about diversity and equality that all schools have perhaps in their on their web pages, like we are committed to being an equal opportunity employers, and the kind of that kind of stuff. But then of course, as soon as you look at the pyramid of power, it's very monochromatic and kind of homogeneous at that level. So in that case, that is something that was more relying on basically organizing people. So finding like-minded allies was very key. Then defining goals and crafting demands, and then voicing these demands, infiltrating the institutional structures. So for instance, becoming a delegate of staff or things like that, like being closer to the places of power, which is just one way to approach, where are decisions being taken, where is the money coming from, like that kind of thing. This is something that doesn't have to be specific to architecture. In that case, it's happened to be in architecture schools, but I think that those things are very prevalent in academia anyway, and possibly in other places as well. So the question was how to instrumentalize an institution that was keen on instrumentalizing that kind of discourse. So being kind of conscious about that and then pushing for change. So that was successful in at least creating, I would say, a space for the discussion on gender specifically and perhaps more, let's say, equity at large to happen, which has basically changed forever, I think, the conversation at the school. And I'm talking specifically about ETH Zurich and the architecture department, which I was for a few years. So I think at that level there has been very useful. This kind of activism I have now, for instance, as I have left that particular institution, I'm basically now working on something that I call a spin-off of that, which is basically a network of support. So it's basically organizing all groups, as many possible as there are, as many as possible groups that are currently working towards equity in architecture schools, and organizing these together and learning from each other. And for instance, supporting initiatives, also going to panels if necessary, but very much about crafting common strategies and tactics on how that could be. So basically learning for each other, guaranteeing that knowledge is not lost also, and that this kind of tactical activism, I guess, is beneficial, and also that it doesn't get lost. I think there is also this, because a lot of this is relying on, how would you say, individual power, and not everybody has the same energy and the same disponibility at the same time. So it is also about guaranteeing a kind of longevity of the structures. So I think that's what I'm currently working with. So the Parity Front is actually dedicated to guaranteeing, or to kind of helping cementing these kind of groups, because they also very often rely on students' activism, which are transient population by nature, and that is to the benefit of the institutions, because then you have the minions, which are the non-tenure faculties, which usually don't find themselves in positions to say anything, because they have to remain liked by everyone. And then the ones who are tenured seem to, I don't know, have lost interest or are busy doing other things. So, how do you guarantee that? How do you maintain a constant pressure on an institution so that it changes? I think that is what I'm currently working on, but more in the shadow, in a way, like more kind of like trying to guarantee that this is gone. And then, of course, the third, perhaps or fourth ways that I can mention is again, this is very much about, I guess, instrumentalizing back, when you find yourself in, let's say, privileged institutions that have, when you have this instant credit that comes with some institution position. So obviously, Harvard is one of those. How do you make the most out of those so that you can push forward an agenda? So in that case, I launched in April that initiative called Global Moratorium on New Construction, which is, a thinking framework. I mean, it makes a lot of people very nervous, and that is actually wonderful, because, I mean, of course, you can look at it as a provocation, but, the situation is serious. So at the same time, how do you engage a profession that is fueling the climate crisis and not really doing any of the work? I just put in the chat earlier the link to the article of our colleague, kind of very disempowering kind of statement on the fact that architecture has to remain outside of politics. I think that this is really, very problematic. So in a way, I guess what I'm heading at with the kind of activism is, as you move you know, how do you actually keep on harnessing the tools at your power, and how do you make the most out of the things that are available without, and this is also about navigating and finding yourself, you know, like also trying to stay safe, I guess, to a certain extent, but very much towards pushing. I think it has a lot to do with how to maintain the kind of the relevance of the discipline, which I think as it distantiates itself from and pointing at the modern project as something that should be really critically assessed at that point, as a way to guarantee a certain relevance, which I think is not, you know, is kind of something that's probably a serious crisis that's emerging, where the design of the built environment is something that's not, you know, that can really be taken away from design disciplines. So yeah, I mean, this is a bit kind of like maybe just a narrated bit, you know, story of how I've engaged personally, and of course I've done all of that with others, and you know, you were talking about authorship, and these things are also obvious, that I have not done any of this on my own, but yeah, I'm committed to that since a while now. It's true.
We should let everyone know that Charlotte may or may not have something in the issue of Bracket Takes
May
Action.
or may not. I can't say.
It may be authored or it may not. It's interesting the direction you're going with the recent work on parity, Charlotte, because you're also making me realize, and it's a frequent realization I have, which is how slow our discipline is, and how slow often the profession is, and how slow discipline is. And I'm wondering, like, maybe there's some benefits in slowness, in the sense that our reaction time as a discipline, as a practice, like, you know, certainly art and music and other creative forms and video and photography, of which many I believe are in the After Hope exhibition, can have a quicker reaction time, right? Architecture takes a while to build, it takes many hands, it takes many minds, it works through a kind of conventions of patronage. And I'm thinking maybe at the core of this idea of alternative methods is really a need to rethink this notion of patronage and from where work originates. And often it's waiting for that commission, often it's waiting for this. And I remember early on in practice, we held a lot of importance around competitions, you know, open competitions, in the hope that this would generate a first work and this would produce things. And increasingly that was dissatisfying, partly because it was difficult financial contribution, self-financial role, you know, really become your own patron, and in the hopes of some larger windfall that can then sustain you. And increasingly we found that just generating your own work was a more fruitful exercise. And then that was, you know, another phase of work. And then a third phase of work was reaching out to others and finding a space of overlook, whether that be a site or a geography like Neeraj was pointing to, or whether it be authors who have not been invited to the table. So finding a platform to invite others. And I guess I'm now reflecting, like, is slowness actually an asset to this process? Is slowness an effective alibi to be patient with collectivity, to be patient with the role that patronage would play, rather than this sort of quick solution? And somehow your provocative website, the moratorium on stopping construction, it's basically saying slow down. Like, the message there is, you know, slow things down here a little bit, and let's reflect. The second thing, maybe there's one or two of you might have a reaction to that. The second thing I was thinking about was, in the list that Neeraj provided, the role that documentary and narrative play. And I don't know if you've seen it, Charlotte, but I feel like I have seen a real turn among students and young practitioners to privilege the role of critical documentation. If you're looking at a space, a city, a condition, a context, a people, to pause, again, slowly, document and reveal and expose either injustices or disconnects, or maybe even spaces for opportunities to insert design or invite design into that space. I feel like this documentary turn is quite effective in repositioning methods and repositioning maybe the origins of design thinking or the origins of practice. Is this something that, I don't know, Neeraj, you or have seen both at CCA and on the West, or Charlotte, you have seen on the East? I'm kind of in the middle here, so I see a little bit of both, but definitely. And at the University of Toronto, where we also have visual studies and art practices, I'd say there was a lot of powerful lessons learned from art practices in this regard. I don't know if you have any experiences on either slowness or thoughts on slowness or documentary practices.
Neeraj, I think maybe you could let us know a little bit about your.
Sure.
I mean, I can jump in afterwards. I have a few ideas and thoughts to share, but I'm also curious to hear.
Yeah, actually, one of the things we've been, because we just launched a couple new classes in our undergrad and graduate stream on analysis of urbanism, and this is for the BArch and MArch core. And we realized that there was a lot of analytical classes that were more geared at software, and kind of tools around that, and that actually having more urban analytical tools would help students situate this. And part of those courses has been structured around chapters around, I guess, ethnography is I think a large word, and I don't know if we would go as far as that, but really through observation of behavior and practices, cultural rituals, having students just spend time with space to learn from how people are using space, and then to capture these in different ways. And so this has actually been, I think, a really key thing that has changed. It's still very new, just 2.5 years now we've been running these new courses, so it's hard to say the full results, but I do notice a difference in students in the way that they're looking at, say, site analysis. I think, this term site analysis is a really key, it's a key component to a design, but I think the way that often site analysis is done in architecture schools is just reading the formal qualities of context, and we're really trying to shift this much more towards behavior, observation. Interviews is really key. And then another big thing we're trying to do at our school is bring the institution outside the school into these neighborhoods, and then bring people and organizations from these neighborhoods into the school. And this often happens not just through critiques and reviews, but through symposia and workshops. And I think this has been a way to overcome that boundary, particularly when we're looking at historically oppressed groups, and many of our students are not coming from those historically oppressed groups. How can they intervene in a meaningful way? And this, I think, has actually really changed the conversation from like aesthetic judgment in design to a much more complex, multifaceted form of judgment. And in fact, and this is something that we can maybe talk about in a little bit, just questions around future forms. I think like a lot of the future forms that I'm seeing with students that are going in this kind of direction are less radical in the kind of traditional way that architectural future forms have been radical. So like a radical future form for environmental change that we might see on many of the blog sites would be like a skyscraper with trees on it, or things like that. And we're really trying to have much more deeper, meaningful contributions to that. And strangely, that shifts the focus from the foreground of what architecture has been more to the background, these overlooked sites and geographies, and having students engage in these underlying protocols that really affect people's lives, and those kind of subtle background recalibrations that produce projects that almost sometimes seem invisible, I think are becoming much more satisfying for students. Because what I really am optimistic about is just seeing students today, they're very politically engaged, and there's a hunger to use the disciplinary tools to create change. And there's, I don't know if I have something to say on slowness, but there's an urgency, I think, to many of these students in how that change might be enacted. And I think we're seeing everything from, the critiques that, are happening on Instagram to, the sites, geographies, and ways of working that students are interested in. And that has been really, truly inspiring to see.
I think it echoes a little bit. One of the question of the audience was, pointing at that and the value of participatory design and how to address, how to move and take action and also these kind of future forms, as you were mentioning. So I mean, a few things about slowness. I mean, it's interesting because someone else actually this morning also mentioned the fact that the moratorium is about slowing down, and I was not sure about that because, or it was about like stopping things, and I was like, no, it's about taking action. So I was like not sure where to locate that, but I think that you're right on some aspects, and of course, one of the grounding, one of the fundamentals of the moratorium is basically the fact that during the pandemic, while everything was stopping, construction sites were basically one of the few things that kept going. So with a few exceptions or with temporary halts, but mostly basically construction very much kept going. So which also talked about, the fact that even though the profession is slow and so on and so forth, the pace of construction is not slow. It is actually very fast, and you can, get a skyscraper built in a year. The planning might take a little bit longer, but the construction itself is actually quite fast if there are no shortages, which now bring us to more current conversations. But I just want to tie it to one term that my colleague here, Rahul Mehrotra, uses when he talks about these kind of phenomena. He talks about impatient capital, which I think is a very good term to kind of point at how we might have, earlier taken more time to think about what we're actually building and, whether we actually really need that. But we are under, the kinds of economical cycles that are, basically not patient. Because money has to go somewhere, and then it has to go. So there is this kind of pressure, and ultimately it's just about the built environment being the receptacle of this kind of capital. And in the end, I mean, at least the big things that are being built across the world so often are about that. So that would be. So I'm not sure where I want to locate this question of like slowing pace, and the inertia of institutions, I think, is related very much to this transiency of populations, of power structures that muzzles a lot of people who would actually say things if they would be in other situations, and so on and so forth. So I think that it's probably a mix of things that make it what it is. And then to go back to, I think you were asking about some of the ways that we could operate. And I always like to think about unsolicited projects as something very useful. Most of this kind of projects I told you about, no one asked me. It's like this meme where it says like nobody, and then me being like, we have to talk about this. So I think that it's also a way to engage, of course, with the urgencies of today, to kind of jump onto unsolicited projects, or basically designing things prospectively, or thinking about, propositional works as something that could engage a conversation. And I think that to also link it to this question about students and how the more younger generation are engaging, I actually second fully Neeraj and the kind of general sense of urgency that younger students or students today have, because it feels like, and that relates again to the inertia of the of schools at least, and then the profession, I think, is totally part of that as well. Is not up to the challenge, I mean, this can be discounted as something irrelevant, but how come architecture schools or art schools have not declared climate emergency, for instance? Even, you can look at it and say, well, this is just a device. We talked about green capitalism and things like that. It's just a device, but at least it would be also already about moving forward. And I think this kind of positioning of architecture being taught as something that is, purely formal, or like something that's very much first and foremost about form, is ultimately a wrong entry point. Because why can't you do form and be aware of the materials you're using? I'm not sure I would actually agree to that. I think that you can actually do that. You should be. I mean, why should everything that is politically should look like trash? Like, I think that there's also this kind of fake dichotomy between engaged design, which looks and then Valerio Olcetti and his concrete arches. So I want to question that. I think that you don't need to abandon form to be relevant. You don't need to abandon form to produce works that are aware of the kind of extractivist practices we rely on as a society. So I think that this is something that students are very aware of, I would say, and I sense it here. I think that the institution has to be a bit more reactive to that if it wants to stay relevant again. And then the profession, I mean, like, don't get me started. The profession is nowhere. Our colleagues, our Pritzker colleagues, thinks that there's nothing that can be done. Other colleagues are, schmoozing with right-wing leaders so that they can build, tourist havens in pristine locations. So, I mean, the ethics of the profession, I guess, can be what is ultimately questioned, so. And I think students also know that as we move into this more and more obvious situation where, every sector of society has to engage, like, I think fashion, for instance, is also a place where people have started to look at that, and then it's being co-opted. The green capitalism is on it, fake repair stores and things like that. I mean, but the conversation is moving, like, people are starting to realize that, and in architecture there are, of course, people also doing that. I mean, I'm being kind of unfair here, but I feel like the immense majority of the practices are, just perpetuating a modus operandi of that has been grounded in the modernist scheme. So
I guess I'm curious about, and this is both for you, Charlotte, and Mason as well, in the work you do, like, just in terms of thinking about institutionality, because we're all tethered to institutions, and in some ways your way of working, Charlotte, is not to give up on the institution. It's not like you're saying, I'm only going to work in a grassroots way, but it's trying to maybe be within it and trying to find the levers within it to push and pull on. And it seems like, within the questions of power, of taking action, many of the things in the book on one hand track these grassroots initiatives with very few resources and people just taking direct action around them, and then other forms of action where people are maybe working at a higher level, whether through planning policy or leveraging the resources of an institution or way of building and so forth, to enact, say, change on a bigger scale or a more widespread change. And I guess I'm curious, because it seems like you're working in both modes a little bit, where you feel, because on one hand I see you saying, like, the institution's not up for it, it's just we're not ready, or the private practice, and especially as private practice in America gets more corporate, the scales of firms are just getting bigger and bigger, and there's very little room for smaller practices to get into doing anything but single family homes, more or less at this point. Do you still believe in the institution? Is there, or does this thing need to be rebuilt from the ground up? Where's your sense on how we might reform or reevaluate, reframe, or do away with institutionality altogether?
Yeah, I mean, we're all three of us are in an institution, right? So this is also a question I would like to pass around. I feel like, to be fair.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, of course.
I mean, the inertia can be very disheartening. I think in our third year of doing this parity work, we coined the term parity fatigue, which was, you know, saying, well, no, nothing is happening. I mean, if I knew that this work, I did that work almost 10 years. If I knew that I would be doing that when I started, I would probably have been like so disheartened because I was just expecting for things to be moving way faster. But again, to the credit of the work of my colleagues and you know, so many people who worked in that, trying to change things, it has been, it changed. Like there are things like, for instance, the people who graduated and have only been in an institution where this was part of the conversation. And these people have moved in offices and they were like, why are you not discussing this in the office as well? So there is also a kind of, maybe the goals that we had set were not achieved. You know, we were like, we were asking for parity, for instance, at the very beginning. And I think from day one, it was clearly something that was never just about gender, but much more about equity, clearly. So, you know, well, the situation has not changed tremendously, but it has changed a little. And so, yeah, just to say, I haven't fully given up on the institution. I think that there is hope, but it's very slow.
Back to the slowness again. Yeah, there's a kind of like Sisyphusian exercise of pushing that boulder. But I was thinking about something you said, Charlotte, this idea, and it's making me realize a blind spot in our list a little bit, Neeraj, and thinking about alternative methods in this after hope moment is organizing. How I mean, you said that a number of times, Charlotte. You said, you know, I organized this, or I spent a lot of time organizing. And there's something kind of powerfully almost clerical and maybe behind the scenes. And I'm sure even our art museum organizers here that have their cameras off and are behind the scenes, the effort in putting in and organize something itself is a form of action making and platform creating for action. So, 10 years may seem like an eternity in that exercise, but all of those meetings and efforts invested in organizing are themselves a kind of seeding of minor actions that play themselves out in the actors that are involved in that. So, but I want to make sure we have time a little bit, and I know we're short, but I wonder, Neeraj, if we should just flash up the future forms list, because I just wanted to see on it and see if we can, maybe some questions from the audience can come up. But I think it's I
think we have about 5 minutes total, just to keep us all on track.
Well, maybe we could just end with it, even if it sits on screen. And Neeraj, you touched on some of these ideas about maybe privileging or acknowledging the bias on foreground over background, and maybe there's a shift needed there. I just wanted to touch hopefully on two ideas I found really powerful in our conversation that we had preparing for today, is thinking about the importance of temporality and the power of ephemeral architecture, the ability for architecture to sort of appear and disappear, the ability for architecture to remake a space that one had a first thought on how it would be used, and again, we see many other forms of practice in the design and creative disciplines, whether it's performance, film, like, you know, Toronto is often a backdrop for filmmaking. I often see the city sort of remade. A portion of the city is remade to look or reenact something or remake or vision something else, and all of these sort of temporal interventions are a powerful what if scenario to citizens and occupants. And then the second idea is this idea of openness and the importance of, and it's part of it's complicit maybe within the idea of privileging background over foreground, is that allowing for multiple readings, allowing for multiple uses of work. Anyway, I just thought it would be nice to not only spend the time talking about methods and organization, but thinking about in what way does some of these action-oriented practices, whether they're writing-based or design-based or they're troublemakers, like Charlotte was referring to, in what way do they manifest themselves? And I think maybe we can let some questions percolate up from the Q&A, or Charlotte, Neeraj, some final thoughts related to that, or I'll pass it over to you.
Yeah, well, I would love to hear what Charlotte has to say, and maybe I can kind of wrap up. And also there is a question I just want to, if this is somehow folded in, that has been asked by Emily, just around kind of participatory design processes, and who's at the table, and might we need to kind of evaluate that in thinking of how these future forms are produced.
Yeah, I mean, the question of future forms is like, I was mentioning earlier how, sometimes when you enter into a particular field of action, you actually, you think things are going to be faster, and you kind of, you don't even really, like, the goal is kind of something articulated, but not really fully fledged as such. And I think I have to say that a lot of what I do is very instinctive and not super planned. So I think when I think about future forms, I for instance, this thing with the moratorium, it evolved. It was like a round table, and we did a little comic, and then it's going to be a book, and maybe a film, and things like that. And things have kind of just come very much organically. And I think that what I'm trying to do with the Parity Front, for instance, is perhaps to re-articulate and rewire, and also look at the past as something that could be really informative. So the idea that the work that you've conducted is something that is formative in nature, and I guess that the future form is also something that has to be perhaps informed, without kind of wanting to do puns, but and this also applies to the way that we think about how we're going to build in the future. I think that this idea of basically either pausing, as Mason was mentioning, or like thinking about the ways that we could look at an architecture that might have been destroyed as a practice by modernism, if I may. Oh, I'm gonna get crucified for saying that, but I think that there is some value to actually backpedal a little and look at how certain things have been done in the past as something that can be very useful for the future. And this has nothing to do with nostalgia. It's not about wanting to go back to a time. It's about looking at how other things have been done, and trying to kind of capitalize on that, and use it as a way to move towards action, for instance, or inactions, or really that. So yeah, and participation is of course part of that. Like, you cannot do none of this can be done alone.
No.
Yeah, I think that's a great, and it's what a great way to spend the morning, chatting with you two about these amazing topics. Maybe just to wrap up, what I think is really fascinating with the work that both of you do is that the forms that are produced by the architect aren't always buildings. Sometimes there's ways of working, sometimes they're books or other forms of research projects, videos. I know, Charlotte, you have something in the Seoul Biennial that's maybe more video based right now. And I think this also kind of expands the question of where the architect might use their tools and narratives and communicate with a broader and larger public. And I just thank you so much, both of you, for being here today. And I also want to thank Padma and the After Hope group for giving this platform, which I think these types of conversations are really at the core of bringing solidarity together and creating, hopefully, venues for us to take action. So thank you so much. This time went by so fast. There's so many other questions I have, but I hope we can follow up and have more conversations at a future time.
Thanks.
Thanks so much. And thanks for everyone for coming out this morning. Thank you.
Yeah, it was really nice.
And thank you, Neeraj, Mason, and Charlotte, for taking the time for today's conversations. I really hope this is just the beginning of many conversations, because I think, as we see, there's lots more to talk about. But I also really appreciated you kind of grappling with the themes of the symposium and the exhibition as part of this call to take action, and what that might mean in terms of reworking or rethinking or reframing practices. And so on our level, that's kind of what we were thinking in terms of After Hope. It's made me think of After Hope as also a way of rethinking or reframing hope itself. So Thank you again for your incredible presentations.
Thank you, Pema.
Thank you, and thanks everyone.